Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Peace and blessings on all of you. Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're at, to each of you who logged in from across America. These are, of course, very solemn and difficult times. So we are immensely grateful that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to join us here tonight. We welcome you to part one of a special virtual series on race and justice, organized by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We titled this series Supreme Justice. Now, the term supreme justice is one that has been very recently used by the international spiritual leader of our community, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, in the wake of the George Floyd murder over a month ago on Memorial Day. It is a term, supreme justice, that's inspired by the verses of the Quran that speak about how justice is paramount. It's also a term inspired by the example of the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said in his famous farewell sermon over 1500 years ago that no white person is superior to a Black person and no Arab is superior to a non-Arab. So the term supreme justice therefore rejects and refutes the claim of those who consider that the white race or any race has supremacy. Rather, it is justice that is supreme. Of course, we all strive to achieve and implement this pristine ideal. But how can we achieve supreme justice in the wake of the grave injustices that we have seen perpetrated against Black Americans? How do we fight systemic racism and racial persecution against Black Americans? How do we dismantle the structures of racism that may feel like impenetrable barriers that stand in the way of supreme justice? How do we invigorate the democratic process to attain supreme justice? So these are just some of the questions we hope this virtual series tackles, beginning with this program tonight. I'm very humbled to be joined by a terrific panel. We have Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is a world-renowned researcher and educator. She completed her graduate and doctorate education in clinical psychology and social work research, and is the author of the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She served for several decades as an assistant professor at Portland State University. Welcome, Dr. DeGruy.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We also have Professor Basiyr Rodney, who is chair of the Department of Teacher Education and an associate professor at Webster University in St. Louis. Dr. Rodney completed his undergraduate work in history and government at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and he teaches courses in technology education, social foundations, and innovative learning practices. Welcome, Professor Rodney. And pretty soon, towards the later part of the program, we'll be joined by United States Congresswoman Karen Bass, who represents California's 37th district. That's here in Los Angeles, where I am, and where Mahershala Ali is as well. And she's been a member of Congress since 2013. She, of course, is the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Today's co-moderator is my dear brother, Mahershala Ali. He doesn't need much of an introduction. Very delighted to have him help me moderate this wonderful panel. Mahershala, I'm really looking forward to having you engage with our panelists shortly. And I was thinking about, as a way to start, before we engage our panelists, to maybe have you get us started here. You know, it's been over a month now since we saw the horrific images of the murder of George Floyd, and this, of course, came at the heels of many other terrible atrocities that we had seen. We've been watching these events, as I'm sure you have, unfold around the country in the past 30 days. I just wanted to start by asking, what are your feelings right now at this moment?
Thank you, brother Amjad, and thank you to all our panelists and everybody tuning in and joining us. I feel exhausted and energized at the same time. And I think what I mean by that is the eh, uh, let's put COVID aside for a moment. This work that we find ourselves, that we find our culture, all sort of in some way, shape, or form, let's assume everyone in some way is impacted and participating in this moment, which is unique. I feel energized by that, but I feel exhausted by the journey of having to arrive at this moment, because I think what is profoundly unique for Black Americans or Black people in this country, even Black people globally, is the fact that we are born into this world with, at some point, being consciously taught, and our parents would do us a disservice actually if they didn't, that racism is built into the ecosystem of our planet, of our world. Coming from our point of view, from our experience, we have to be made aware that there's this virus out there that specifically impacts us. and and so the fact is that from 4 years old on, you're going to start getting these very clear messages that there's a difference in your experience, right? And so I'm in my 40s. The world has always been this way. And leading up into this moment, people have not listened when we have tried to communicate the fact that our neighborhoods, our schools, our education, the criminal justice system itself, like all these elements in our world affect our upward mobility, affect our ability to be whole, affect our ability to be healthy, affect our ability to heal, affect our ability to be truly independent. Like, you can go on and on. So my point is, the exhaustion comes from existing like in that reality. And I don't care how many awards you get or how much fame you get. Like, the difficult part is that you will be quickly reminded that you're not that special at any given moment, and so that fall to reality is challenging. But I think leading up into this moment, and the fact that there is an awakening happening, and I will kind of say a white awakening, and I don't mean that in any flippant way, but the white awakening is a blessing for us, but it's also more work for us, because we're having to process now what white people are waking up to. And if you're in close proximity to somebody, and they value your opinion and you as a person, you're going to be the person who has to also work out stuff that they're just now discovering that you were like, yeah, I was trying to tell you about that a long time ago. So it's you can't help but be inspired and appreciate the fact that there are people of all races and cultures and ages out there in these streets, or have been in the streets, and making phone calls and emails and really trying to participate in and really, dismantling some things that have been problematic from the inception of this country. But also just a little bit tired by that as well. And so trying to be kind to myself and allow myself to take a breather somewhat. But also still being very much engaged and conscious, and knowing that, like, this is not something you just get to quit working on. This is something that this consciousness has to be something that an awareness has to be inculcated we have to embrace that awareness and allow that to impact our actions, how so many of our systems function. So that is my long-winded answer to how I'm feeling right now. And I'm also still very much in the moment because every day is different. And then now we're back to dealing with, not that we ever stopped dealing with COVID, but now there's sort of this new awareness of this COVID outbreak. And of course, Black and brown people are going to be disproportionately impacted by that. And people who our leadership is not taking this seriously, like, because their actions show that they're not taking it seriously. So it's frustrating, but I'm hopeful. I'm glad we get to do this here today. And with that, I want to take this opportunity to ask Dr. DeGruy to basically, for us, kind of lead us up to this moment in time where let's put if we even can, because people believe that they kind of know all there is to know about slavery, and slavery happened. Perhaps we could start from emancipation, this concept of emancipation. And because I feel like it would almost be irresponsible for us to try to have a conversation about what is going on in this moment now without really framing the context for how we realistically got to this moment where Black and brown people are consistently throughout our country having a very different experience in terms of what it is to be an American than, say, white people. And so I would love if you could kind of, with whatever time you need, take us through the American experience, even if it's just the kind of the larger points in this journey leading up to this moment. And within that, I just have one request, just in case you may not think to speak on it. I would love to hear you speak on the Homestead Act as well, and how just those things play into the system that we find ourselves experiencing now, if that's okay with you.
I'll try.
I like to start with those easy questions, those softballs.
I'll do the best I can, you know. First of all, I think, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. And I think this is certainly an appropriate arena for us to begin to have these dialogues within a space of understanding our spiritual presence, our spiritual reality, which is fundamental to, this is what the basic problem is all the way around, is we don't know who and what we are. I think I would like to start with the Constitution. And if we understand the American Constitution, we have to recognize that, the whole notion of democracy and freedom kind of flies in the face of the reality. And the reality was, while folks were pinning "we the people" in order to form a more perfect, when we're putting that together, they never intended for people of African descent to be involved in that. Hence, we were 3/5 human. In addition to that, if you were a woman, you weren't included. If you were a person of color, you weren't included. And if you weren't a white male, wealthy, and a homeowner, you weren't included. So we have to understand that the basic Constitution of America was centered around this idea of white supremacy and white male supremacy. Not, again, and not everybody that was white male was in that "we the people." So the contradiction, the dissonance that shows up for me, and did as a social scientist, was, while we hear these incredible words, "send us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, one nation under God, indivisible," and at the same time, all of these things are being espoused, and indeed noble words, we were committing genocide as a country against Native people, and we were enslaving people of African descent, which lasted over 300 years. So you say, how in the world do we reconcile that idea? Because it creates cognitive dissonance, thinking discord, because you're simultaneously holding within you contradictory ideas, thoughts, and beliefs. So what human beings have to do, and as a clinician, it's very clear when we're dealing with folks who are troubled, dissonance plays a huge role in it. So how do you calm the dissonance associated with oppressing or subjugating an entire group of people for 300 years and then go to church? Okay, how do you reconcile that dissonance? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to justify your behavior. And they not only justify their behavior to the immediate American population, they justify their behavior to the world, which is the reason why it's a global issue. And so how do we justify subjugating or oppressing an entire group of people for hundreds of years? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to say, well, there's something reasonable about what I'm doing. I'm going to justify it because in some way explaining that they deserve what we're doing to them, which means that we then have to relabel those people in such a way that makes American chattel slavery seem reasonable, right? And so when we start looking at emancipation, here's the problem. There's a myth that slavery ended, playing field got level, and everybody went on their way. That's a myth. The first thing that happened, so I have a slide in my presentation that says, where did slavery go, after emancipation? Well, it didn't go. That's the first thing, because you're now asking the very people who are perpetrating to police themselves. Kind of happening now too. But the bottom line is that we have an expectation that those who created the system, and let me just say that every major institution in America is governed by the principles of white supremacy. I'm not saying that to be harsh. That's a fact. That's just the truth. And that means that it's like any lie. You got to get everybody to sign on, right? So you had to have educators, science, religion, medicine, media, law. Everybody had to sign on that this was an appropriate thing to do for over 300 years. So the first thing that happened was peonage, the unlawful selling of people back into slavery. We saw 12 years a slave. Well, it wasn't just him. So that's the first thing that happened. Then after that, they said, well, we outruled the fact that, we got to move this thing along, because remember, America, this is all governed by greed, materialism, power, and money at the end of the day. So we said, so how do we continue as a country, but keep our stuff, namely our power over those people that become the labor force? So the second thing that happened, they said, well, we're going to free you, but you better not come here where we are, north, south, east, or west, because what they put in place were black codes, better known as sundown laws. They say you might be free. In the state of Oregon, they created an exclusionary act saying that no free slave can abide, be within, own property, live, and if you don't leave, this was only abolished in 1926. It said, and if you don't leave, we'll beat you at least 30 stripes on your back. Now remember, we're free. We're free now. This is 1926 that was abolished. So even though you were, quote, free, you couldn't go anywhere. So then you go back and you become a sharecropper, right? So now we're looking at our survival. So you go back because they're going to lynch you, beat you, ostracize you if you try to go anywhere else. Again, you're free, but you better not come here. So folks went back, and people don't understand what sharecropping was another form of slavery, because you couldn't read or write. And so the past slave owner says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to advance you seed, tools, and a mule. Don't worry about it. We'll settle up at the end of the year. And then what happened at the end of the year? Oh, you were found owing. So how do you satisfy that debt? Because you don't have money. Well, I'm going to work it off, which is another form of slavery, right? Because I can't read or write. Are you following me? So this is something that, again, they're the mythology of this kind of balanced playing field. And then they said, okay, and they realized that black codes, sundown laws, people said, well, I'm going to go to a place. I want my children to go to a place. And you had the Great Migration. You had folks that were moving to all parts of the country. But what did they find when they got there? We have to understand that American policing, which everyone should know, American policing, and I've trained thousands of police officers, clearly ineffectively, okay? I'm going to own that right now. So in all that training of police officers, FBI, the CIA reached out to me recently. I said, no, I'm not doing that to myself or anybody else. But if you look at American policing, you have to understand its ideology. You have to understand where it came from. And it was born from slave patrols. Slave patrols were enacted right after emancipation because they said, the fear was a pathological fear that Black people would do to white people what they had done to them. But we didn't create a vigilante gang, but they did. The Klan is the largest gang in America. Why? Because of their own pathology around what they've projected because of their own behavior. And so they terrorize Black people. Police officers know this. That's the history of policing. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing what we're seeing. About 2 years ago, there was a huge thing that came to, it didn't actually even get to the Supreme Court, but it was police officers having Black faces as target practice. So when they would go to the range, they'd had Black faces. And of course, Black police officers said, this is inappropriate. And they said, well, if they're criminals, why not? That got passed, that you get to practice shooting a Black face. Now, the gentleman that argued about it, they actually got a picture of his brother who had been a criminal, who had served time and used his face to shoot at on the range. That's so we cannot be surprised when we see that knee on the neck and the person with no sense of reality as to the humanity of this human being. So how we got here, when we start looking at it, everything in terms of laws, you had segregation. We said, okay, all right, good, we got this. You don't want us near you. You want to segregate us. Well, we built towns, like Black Wall Street, like Rosewood, Greenwood, all of these different, and they bombed them, not before they looted them. They looted them first and then they destroyed them, right? So they said, no, we can't have you get over there. We need you and we need your money. And then we bought the illusion of inclusion. And then we said, okay, they're letting us back in. But then they did something else. They said, yeah, but we still don't want you near us. So now let's take a look at the whole idea of the GI Bill. I know I kind of skipped around, but this becomes critical. So you had a GI Bill. Everybody goes, we get the GI Bill was for veterans, right? Now, if you look at that this is a federal program that said that, this helps people create wealth by home ownership, right? And so what the federal government said, it was immoral, quote, immoral to have Black people live in proximity of white people. That's what the federal government said. They said, but we'll leave it up to states to decide. Well, the states were segregated. So guess who didn't get the GI Bill, right? So there's this consistent mythology. And then they did redlining. So again, they separated us out and they put us in food deserts, as they do now, in areas where there is absolutely nothing, poor educational systems, no economic base. Those are the kind of things that happen. But still, we said, okay, we're gonna make that happen. And then after redlining, after Jim Crow, you had redlining, and then you had new words, urban renewal. Urban renewal, which is another separation. And then you had curing urban blight. That was another one. And then you had gentrification. And what we call that in my particular center of people and clinicians is serial forced displacement. Serial forced displacement. So then we have to look at the research and the science of what happens to people that you consistently uproot and move. Well, guess what the end result is? Personal and structural violence. Here we go. So we, again, these things, and of course there's a whole litany of things that laws were put in place, like the Homestead Act and others, where it wasn't equal. It wasn't fair. It wasn't just, not then and not now.
Yes. So what, with all that you just shared, what feels, how are you feeling about this moment that we're in? And do you feel truly like it is unique and potentially leading to real lasting change, opposed to how we've been kind of incrementally kind of pushing along over centuries?
You know, glad you asked that. It's unique. I'm 62 years old. Oh, I might even be holding up the I'm the elder here.
Mm.
And I was, you know, I was in the Watts riot. You know, I grew up in LA, South Central, you know, so I was, you know, I remember that process, and I remember being there. And there's something really different about right now. And what's really different is, I believe, for the first time in my life, the entire globe is saying, shame on you, America.
Mm.
Shame on you.
Mm.
And I think that the other piece is this pandemic, which, and I've heard, you know, you've heard lots of people talk about the pandemic and the fact that disproportionate numbers of people, brown people and black people, native people, are dying. That was true before COVID.
Right.
That was true. We're disproportionately dying of all the major diseases, all the major health indicators. We're topping out every single time. Why? Because of access, history. I mean, you got to look at how we've lived throughout that process, or in many ways have been forced to live. So we're looking at a time where, for me, was an opportunity.
Mm.
We were a germ.
Mm.
A germ that you can't see brought humanity to its knees.
Yes.
And it was an opportunity for us to stop and to recognize that we are one humanity.
Mm.
But soon thereafter, people started drawing the lines in the sand once again, mining yours, opportunistic power. All of these things start showing up. But at the same time, we were forced, in a way, to look at a reality over and over again, a public lynching over and over again. We don't have the distractions now. We don't have them to redirect us, to somehow allow us to remove ourselves from the truth that was in front of us. And then became that internal thing that happened for each individual. Where am I going to be on the side of history?
Mm.
Where am I going to stand on the side of history? And I think that, you know, and I've said this, and it probably seems harsh, but this is also the first time in my life that the nice white person doesn't get a pass. Because, see, white people didn't have to be engaged in issues of poverty or police use of deadly force or Black Lives Matter, or any of that. They could just be nice white people and, you know, shop at, you know, Whole Foods and wear Birkenstocks with socks. They didn't have to worry about anybody else. That's something that they could do and just be nice people.
Yeah.
But now, for the first time in the life of white America, you don't get a pass. The rest, every person looks at you and goes, are you one of them? I wonder if you're one of them. And these are folks that say, look, now, I want to get into that whole race thing, but I don't want you to think I'm one of them. Okay, I don't, listen, I have people opening the door for me 2 blocks away. No, I'll hold it. Just come on, right? Because they want me to know I'm not one of them. You can't stand on the fence now.
Right.
And what people are showing is what side they want to be on. And this is a first. And so with this comes an extraordinary opportunity, and a proposition that it's possible.
Yes.
That we can reclaim our humanity and move forward for the first time.
Let me ask you one more question real quick before we jump to Dr. Basiyr. What are the impacts of, it's kind of 2 parts. What are the impacts on us as Black people in having to witness, I think it's Brother Rashard Brooks, who got killed in Atlanta, shot in the back, Brother George Floyd. We didn't see Breonna Taylor's death, but Ahmaud Arbery. We can go like on and on, Oscar Grant. There's so many people, Eric Garner, that we witnessed take their last breath. And I just see Black trauma on screen. and I see tickets being sold a lot, meaning, you know, headlines and attention and eyes, and you see Brother George dying over and over and over and over again. I'm clear on what the officer's knee on his neck. I'm clear at this point. I feel like everybody's seen it, right? Like, you're not seeing it much anymore because it was a little while back. But what is that casual viewing in our culture that kind of almost entertainment, news entertainment, that violence against Black bodies? How does that impact me, us? And why does it take something that extreme and the playing over and over and over and over again of these heinous crimes? Why does it take that for people to go in the middle of a pandemic to go, oh, you know what? Black Lives Matter kind of makes sense now. Like, I get it. Yeah, all lives matter, but like, oh, that didn't mean Black people, right? Why does it take something that extreme, which causes us more pain, to have to witness your brother, basically, because you feel in these moments, these are the moments where I think at times, whether it's in great success or in tragedy, I feel like as a whole, Black people feel most connected, because it when we have success, it touches to our core because we feel like we're all having success. And when we die, we feel like we all got killed.
Yes.
Why does it take that for people to go, oh, you're human?
Because let's move it back. And again, all of my work, you know, which is about healing, by the way, you know, the book is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. You can't heal what you don't understand. So let's move it back so we can understand the etiology of this. So there was something called the Casual Killing Act. The Casual Killing Act came into place during slavery, and it was, you know, actually state to state had their own versions of the Casual Killing Act. And this act made it lawful, and in other words, okay for you to kill someone while correcting them. Stay with me. So if you are in the act of correcting an enslaved person, and you happen to kill that person in that correction, it would not be accounted a felony, but every person giving such correction would be acquit of all blame, as if such accident had never happened. That's literally called the Casual Killing Act. So what you've basically said is, you have removed my humanity. We have dehumanized you. And see, once you dehumanize people, the same thing Unter mentioned, what you know, no matter how you look at it, when you, or even if you look at other places in the world where these atrocities have occurred, it's through dehumanization. So we dehumanize folks to such a degree that we normalize the terrorism against them. We normalize it. We begin to live with it. And what you brought out, Brother Mahershala, is that we have been impacted by the disaster porn. The disaster porn that everybody has fed on in this country. So I'm going to give it to you from the vantage point of something that probably all of the those folks listening kind of understand, but I want to break it down a little bit more, and that is post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. I want you to stay with me because we're going to look at 300 years of trauma. Please. Okay, 300 years of trauma. So let's say that post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that occurs as a result of experiencing a single trauma, directly or indirectly. If we were in the same room and I shot you, heaven forbid, you would be traumatized. Not only that, let's say that Zafar or Basiyr was sitting next to you, traumatized too, because they saw it. Someone maybe was in the hall, didn't see it, heard the shot, later on found out it was you, they're traumatized. Your family back in LA get the phone call that it happened, they're traumatized. Any one of those people would need stress-related treatment to be able to move on in a healthy way. Are you following me? So now just take and multiply that by 300 years of not one trauma, but a lifetime of trauma. Not just my trauma, but my mama's trauma and my daddy's trauma and my next door neighbor's trauma.
Mm.
And when we say, okay, now you're free. Okay, you're free. But who came in? Where were the doctors outside the borders to come and help put us back together when we've watched these things over and over again? So what's happening is we're triggering Black people. Not only that, you have an epigenetic thing going on, right? So I'm really going to be fast.
Please.
But if you start,
that's why we're here.
you start looking at what we know about epigenetics. Now, when I wrote the book 15 years ago, I have a clue, honest to God, about epigenetics. I just knew what I was looking at. I understood what it meant when someone Black, in an effort to insult another Black person, called them Black first. In an effort to hurt them more. So how can I hurt you with your Blackness when you are Black? Right? So we start looking at what it did to our own heads and our beliefs about who we are, being light-skinned and having good hair, and oh, she was pretty even though she was dark. You see, all of that is what generations of dehumanization produce. Because I'm not who I think I am, and I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think that you think that I am. We arrive at our self-esteem based on the appraisals of the people in our environment. And if those people are broken, we learn broken stuff and we pass it along. My work is about teasing the poison from the cookies, teasing the negative adaptive behavior from the rich culture and resilience and power that we have. But let's take a look at epigenetics quickly. Please. So when they started doing work with, these mice. And what they did was they accustomed the mice to develop an aversion to, say, the smell of peppermint. So easily they would release the smell of peppermint and they shock the mice. After a while, they associate the shock with, the stimulus. So what ends up happening after a while is they don't even have to shock the mice. They just release the smell and the mice go crazy. Well, then they tested the babies of those mice. And the babies were born with an aversion to peppermint, having never been exposed. Wow. And then they tested the grandbabies of those mice. And they were born with an aversion to peppermint, having never been exposed. So now they knew that somehow trauma associates itself with markers on the DNA. Wow. So now if you think one trauma can produce enough stress that requires medication and people talking to you softly twice a week, what do you think 339 years of trauma produced?
Yes.
And how do you unpack that? So that's what's happening. It's triggering a whole lot of stuff that no one's even bothered to look at.
Understood.
But I did.
Thank you. Yeah.
Amjad.
I see our dear Congresswoman on the line. Congresswoman Karen Bass, it looks like she's joining. I think we're waiting to get her video up here. I want to turn to her in a moment, especially about the work she's been doing on police reform, which is so much in the news. As I was hearing you, Dr. DeGruy, and Mahershala as well, it dawned on me that there's something really fundamental going on here, that where you see injustice, there's usually intentionality. If you think about an injustice, a civil wrong or a criminal wrong, as I would, let's say, in my legal practice, it's inescapable that an injustice has to be based on a malintent. And when you talk and chronicle the history as you have, coming to recognition with the idea of intentionality is very important. And that intentionality, that the idea of intentionality, institutionalized and otherwise, and the perpetrators of this racial persecution, the intentional nature of what's happening must be borne in mind. Congresswoman, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. We're into this conversation. We're delighted to have you on. I know you're very busy, and you've been working so hard in what seems like, in congressional terms, just an incredibly rapid pace
Yes.
to get this George Floyd Policing Justice and Policing Act passed, which you did. And I congratulate and commend you, all of us do, on those activities. As before you joined, we were talking, we're getting an education really from Dr. DeGruy, and I was just commenting, I don't know if you caught that, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, about this idea of intentionality when it comes to injustice, the idea that the policies that we've seen, the history that we've seen comes from an intentional place and space. And of course, I would like for you to comment about all the work that you've done, because I've known your work. I know it dates back actually to the 1970s, and all the work you've done in the state level, because I know you're my congresswoman, so I see that work. But I want you to comment on what was your purpose in trying to get this bill passed rapidly, and how do you feel it addresses the systemic issue?
Sure. Well, let me comment on the first part that you said in terms of why to get it done rapidly. You know, in my life, I've seen several times when you have movements that pop up. And to me, anytime you have a mass reaction like we saw with the murder of George Floyd, and people say, well, what was different this time? We've seen people shot as they're running away. We saw Eric Garner. I mean, we've seen this before. I thought it was all going to be over when Rodney King, with that videotape. I'm like, okay, we've been fighting for years, and now we have a videotape, so it's over. Everybody's going to believe us. The cops are going to be convicted, and then we all know what happened. A few years later, cell phones were invented, and we've seen tape after tape. But I think this time, though, it was undisputable. Because, you know, when tapes had happened, people went into this thing of, well, we don't know what happened before the tape. We don't know who this person was. We don't know what they did. I mean, frankly, I don't care what they did. I mean, we are supposed to have this justice system where you get arrested, you get tried, and you get convicted or not, innocent until proven guilty. And then just the extreme disparity. When Dylan Roof went in and killed 9 people in Mother Emanuel Church, they arrested him peacefully. He said he was hungry. They made sure he had lunch on the way to the police station. So, you know, what I thought, though, about George Floyd was that we all saw his slow, torturous execution. No one could debate what was happening before the tape. You saw him laying down, and you saw 3 people assisting in his murder. And the guy that was killing him was looking dead at the camera. He didn't even care. He had his hand in his pocket because he was acting with complete impunity. And so when we put the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act together, members of the Congressional Black Caucus had been fighting against police abuse for decades. And some of those bills were bills that they had been fighting for a long time. And so we were able to put the package together relatively quickly. But in my experience, it's critical that you act fast while the public sentiment is high. And I always believe in capturing that energy and channeling it. And within 30 days, we put the bill together. We voted on the bill on the 18th birthday of Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice, if the bill had been passed 7 years before, would have graduated high school. And part of the bill calls for a registry of bad officers. If that police chief had known that that officer had been fired because he had a propensity to violence and he demonstrated that he was unstable, then I would assume that that police chief wouldn't have hired him. So we think that these officers should be publicly known, and they really shouldn't be hired at all. And what I learned, because I'm from Los Angeles, so you know, that's a big city, but I learned that in a lot of the smaller cities around the country, these officers bounce from department to department, and we want to stop that. So, but you know, I think when I joined, you were talking about intentionality, and you know, we are dealing with a white supremacist in the White House, and you know, he never stops. I mean, every time I think he's hit bottom, he finds 10 feet lower to go. And today, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization, been there, done that. So were the Panthers. You know, if you look back at the Panthers' 10-point program, they were calling for social services. You know what I mean? And they were calling for defending the community from the police. Some things don't change. And so I think that the president is extremely intentional with race, bigotry. He's on Asians now. I mean, he's had time with all of us. He started with Mexicans, went to black folks, went to Native Americans, and he's on Asians now, trying to blame Asians for the pandemic that he could have stopped, but he didn't. And so I think whenever he's in trouble, he goes to race. Whenever he's in trouble, he goes to race. What I like, though, is that this morning I heard a poll where 19% of Republicans, 19%, think that the government is moving in the right direction. The nation is going in the right direction. 19%. So he's even losing his base. And I saw also a poll on race, and it seems like white America, and this doesn't usually happen, because usually the polls are after one of these shootings, black folks say this, white folks say this, and it's completely opposite. This time it's not. And people have discovered this term called systemic racism. I'm excited. I don't care if you discovered it yesterday. It's been around, 400 years. But people are connecting this murder with bigger issues. And I think that that is a very, very positive thing. I think we've seen a seismic shift. But let me just tell you something. I've seen a seismic shift, and I've seen a shift back. So I don't take it for granted. Rodney King heightened awareness. O.J. Simpson went back.
I would love to chime in here. Congresswoman Bass, it's Mahershala.
Yeah.
How
Good
are
to
you?
see you?
Thanks for joining us. My question for you is, can policy changes, can they go as far as to impact the hearts? Can they go as far as to impact the hearts and minds of people? Because as much as we all appreciate laws being in support of our freedoms, the fact is that there has to be a spirit under the law, right? There has to be in our communities, like we know that it isn't good to speed or run a red light, but also there has to be a spirit of awareness why that isn't good, right? And the damage that it can cause. And so as much as I see people mobilizing behind the issues of systemic racism and criminal justice reform, law enforcement issues and all that, is it enough? Is it what we need to also change the deeper, to get down to this deeper disease, this virus within our culture? Do policies help with that?
Well, you know, I don't ever think that policy is enough. And let me just tell you, first of all, getting the policy passed and getting it signed by the president is really kind of the first step. Then you have to fight for implementation. And I'm an organizer at heart. So to me, the policy is a necessary vehicle, but it is most certainly not enough. The policy can be used in a lot of ways. I think you change people's hearts through education, through interaction, through relationships. And I think that the policy can help with those things. You absolutely need it, but it does not solve the problems.
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned education, Congresswoman, and Dr. Basiyr Rodney's on, who has been doing deep work in this space. And Professor Rodney, we'd like to hear from you on everything we've been talking about. I mentioned about the intentionality. You've obviously seen the legislative work that's happening. But how do you view this particular predicament? Because there is a moment, surely, but is it going to create the type of kinetic energy to have that change?
So good afternoon again. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel. And I've been reading some of the questions, and everybody is really so well-meaning and focused and energized. I think there are a couple of ways to think about the kind of space we're in as I kind of see it, and just to contribute to some of the comments I've been hearing here from our panelists. You know, this history of white supremacy goes back, at least in the Western Hemisphere, to the arrival of Columbus. And I don't think we want to understate the fact that this has been a very traumatic event and disruption in the history of world communities. Some of the questions that people sometimes ask, it's like, well, why can't you? Why are we also upset when it's so when it's so far back in time, and why is it still with us? And at the root of that is the fact that this is a 500-year occurrence, and every attempt that Black people have made to push themselves forward and to appeal to the morality of the nation and of the world has been responded to with violence, right? With violence. So I think seeing this kind of uprising today is symptomatic that it's not only us that see this, that other communities are seeing it too, and they're stepping out. And this is a wonderful thing that we can see so many Black people, but also white people, Asians, Arabs, Southeast Asians, Chinese, all kinds of people come out and say that what we're seeing, structural violence, structural injustice against Black people, needs to stop. And we want to build a new, not just a new America, a new world. I mean, that's what people are really saying. They're saying it with their bodies, they're saying it with their hands, they're saying it with every part of their being. And we can't discount the cameras in this, right? As Congresswoman was saying, we've seen this repeatedly many times, but there was always this sense of doubt, right? So, well, what did the person actually do? Why did the police stop him? What was he involved in? Why was he in that neighborhood? He shouldn't have been there anyways. All the other kind of things that kind of are allowed to creep up in our minds because of the scars of the system in which we exist. But the cameras tell the tale. 8 minutes and 40 seconds on a knee on someone's neck, taking their lives in the middle of the street while the rest of the world watches is a grave, grave, dehumanizing injustice. And in a way, what we're attempting to do now, even with conversations like this, is to restore the humanity of white people. We're trying to give back, the oppressive forces an identity, a human identity, that we are human, and there's a way in which we ought to exist and be as human. And I think that really compels me, it moves me, despite the tragedies, despite the occurrences, the ability to look at the system that has been so debilitating for so long. I was reading something last week. There's a new project now out of NYU. The first slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere occurs in 1521 in what is now the Dominican Republic, right? This is as far back as this kind of thing goes. And for us to find ourselves today, people taking down these statues, city governments taking down racist icons and icons of oppression and domination. These are powerful things to see. I think my 3-year-old and 4-year-old will be growing up in a different world. I think Mahershala, your daughter will be growing up in a different world, a world where people are at least confronting our own weakness in not being able to obliterate racism. When you mention the aspect of education, I think that's critical. Today, we find ourselves at a spot in the United States where our schools are segregated, if not more, than before the 1954 Brown decision. This is a tragedy. Whole generations fought for equal access and quality access to education, and to now find ourselves in a place where African Americans are in substandard schools all over the country, because that poor education obviously tells on who we become as people, right? And education denied is really disgraceful in today's world. And so all of this moment, what we're also seeing is this rise of public education, forums like these, right? As Dr. DeGruy says, all of us are acquiring new vocabularies, right? When I look at the chat and see some of the words that people are using, or people are talking about, we're saying white supremacy as a matter of course, and we should. This has been the reality, and people are asking questions about microaggressions and racist policies and prejudices. So this is really critical that we're seeing. We're going back to the teachings of the 60s. These are modern virtual teachings where the people in the struggle are educating the population about how this should be and how we should understand it and then move towards it. And I want to kind of cap this off by saying that we as I look here at a worldwide audience, I'm very observant of the fact that the leader of our organization, His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad, has been teaching us for many years that we should confront. We should have conversation. We should, if world peace is what we are seeking as people of spirit, then we should be willing and ready to hold conversations like these publicly, so that people can understand that it's okay to uncover the historical reality and then think about and chart a path forward. So I want to end there, but I think it's really important that we're doing this. I want people to see this not just as symbolic, but we are in the work in this moment, right? This education we're getting, this cultivation of knowledge is a part of that work, and we should take away with us an awareness of the realities that we're facing, yes, and some of that history, but also take this conversation into our homes, to our families, to our friends, and talk about how we're going to move this world forward in a more just and spiritually whole way.
May I ask Congresswoman Bass, because I know we only have so much time with her, what are the policies and practices that, thank you, Brother Basiyr, for that answer as well. Congresswoman Bass, what are the practices and policies in your mind that stand out as being sort of the most egregious, or the ones that sort of contribute to this state of oppression that we've been, like, if there were three that, if you had the power to change tomorrow, these three policies or these three practices, with your knowledge of government and how things operate, knowledge of how our communities work, how funds are allocated, all that, like, what are a couple of things that really stand out to you that if we could kind of just change that would accelerate the march toward equality and equal opportunity?
Well, I mean, if I just had to pull three out of the air, it would be education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. But let me just describe it kind of a different way. So, we did the policing bill, and today the Congressional Black Caucus had a press conference where we talked about addressing systemic racism and understanding that policing is just a manifestation of systemic racism. But one of the things that I think has to happen in our country, aside from the fact that people in the United States, we don't even know our own history, okay? I mean, we have a habit of, we like nice stories, like Washington's cherry tree that he supposedly chopped down, but we don't talk about the 300 human beings he owned and what a pretty bad, I mean, you can't have a good slave owner, okay? So, but anyway, I know he was terrible. Or Thomas Jefferson, the fact that Sally Hemings was a child and she was a sex slave. I mean, you can make it look nice if you want to. But I think that we have to examine every institution in our country, and we have to look at institutional racism in every institution. That's one of the problems in our country, is that people have looked at racism as being bad behavior, as opposed to racism is about power. It's about institutional and society power. And then you look at Black folks and say, well, slavery was so long ago, why can't you guys get it together? Well, I love how Brian Stevenson talks about slavery's evolution as opposed to slavery's ending. But if you don't know your history, then it's very hard to figure these things out. So you have to know your history first, and then you need to examine the institutions. And so we talked about legislation today like that. And Representative Barbara Lee has a bill that's not quite the truth and reconciliation of what was done in South Africa. But you're talking about a country, if you go down the street and ask 10 Americans how long slavery lasts, you'll get 10 different answers. And some people will think 10 years, but I'll tell you one answer you won't get is 256 years. And 100 years of apartheid after that, and re-enslavement. You won't get those answers. And then you wonder why Black folks have a hard time. So anyway, I really think we have to examine society's institutions, and we have to look at the inequity that's baked in those institutions, and then talk about how we extract that.
But if it's everywhere, what is the I keep thinking about this sort of cancer analogy. And if you see that the bulk of a cancer is somewhere in the heart, but then you got some in the finger and you got some in the elbow and the arm and under the armpit, like how do we not die? Like how do we remove this cancer from our system?
Because you know what, we have a lot of people. So I'm going to get a team of doctors to tackle every part of that body. Yeah. Because really, I mean, my hope, my energy, my inspiration, what keeps me going is our history. And the fact that, I mean, you know, let me just give you a story. After Trump was elected and everybody was down in the toilet, and I was too, I went and I spent 3 hours in our museum. I call it our museum. I spent 3 hours in the basement. And I looked at every video. I read every exhibit. 256 years of enslavement, and I got a problem because we elected a white supremacist? I mean, I says, let me get a grip. Yeah. We are the strongest people around to have survived all that we have done, and we've still thrived. Granted, a lot of our folks, and which is why I'm here today. If we all thrived, I wouldn't be here. But my job here is for those people that were left behind. I kind of feel like my ancestors must have felt, who were freed people, who then felt that their life should be about getting their people who are not free out of enslavement. And so I'm the 21st century version of that. And the reason I'm in Congress is because there's still a lot of my people that aren't free, are still suffering. And so I'm inspired by all of the people around me that feel committed in Congress now, where there's 435 of us, and you know who I work with, so I can talk about that. But what keeps me going is the 55 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. We meet every Wednesday, and we fellowship and strategize and talk about how we're going to continue to move our agenda. My complaint about the Black Caucus, though, and the reason why I wanted to be the chair, is because the Black Caucus has a bad rep because people don't really know what we do. And for whatever reason, the Black Caucus has never really bothered to communicate much to Black America about what we do. So people think we come together once a year and have a party, as opposed to, you know, I mean, and I sit in the room with some of my colleagues who have done incredible stuff, and they just go about their business and never really bother to, and I think that's a problem. I think that's wrong. If we want to inspire people, then we need to let them know what it is that we're doing. And so I feel like, you know, yeah, it's a cancer, but we got a lot of doctors, and we can treat that body from head to toe.
Thank you.
And by our museum, you mean the National Museum of African American History?
Yes, I'm sorry. I did mean that. Yes. Yes.
Oh, Brother Basiyr and also Dr. DeGruy, and Congresswoman Bass, feel free to chime in. How do we raise our children in this environment? And what I mean is, there's times when these events happen, these moments happen. 45 could say something, and there are these moments where it feels dehumanizing, frustrating, soul crushing, triggering. So if you yourself as an adult with all your faculties and experiences can find yourself at times with a heavy heart, how do you guide these children into being whole and happy, high functioning in an environment that is clearly not their ally or necessarily working to support them to get into great schools, to get into colleges, to, if they don't have a We Welcome Black People internship program, you're probably not getting that job, right? And they're still under in terms of percentage, still vastly white, these corporate America. Like how do you speak to what is so obviously discouraging as a norm for Black and brown youth. How do you keep their heart open and keep them inspired in this life?
I'd like to respond to that, but I also going to have to leave. I'm actually doing something called Wellness Wednesdays, and we are devoting today, Joy DeGruy Publications, to children. So it's just so interesting that you asked that question. That's exactly where I'm going. Two things that I would say is children are extraordinary. My son had a pretty intense environment experience where the police, put a gun to his head because of walking while Black. And there are two things that I would say. One is something called learned helplessness. And then there's something else called learned self-efficacy or vicarious self-efficacy. What we have to realize is no matter what's going on now, there were people that were looking at 100 years of slavery in front of them and at least 100 more in front of them and some more after that. And they still felt hope. You see what I'm saying? Someone had to tell a child, even though they had been 100 years of slavery, that, this too shall pass and we will rise again, and to give hope. So I know we can do it now. But what we have to be careful of and what we have to be aware of is something called learned helplessness. If someone locks the door and says, and for years and years and years, anyone who came to the door, they beat them down, they killed them. After a while, people don't go to the door. Right. In fact, not only is the door, no one at the door now, the door is open and folks still won't go through. That's called learned helplessness. And we'll do studies about it. We'll do a study of why the people won't go out. Or I can take you by the hand and walk you out the door, which is immediate efficacy. Because if you're my hero and you walk through the door, I believe I can. That's vicarious learned self-efficacy. So our children believe us. They trust us. But we've got to walk our talk, and we got to take their hand through the door. Don't talk about walking through the door. Walk through the door with them. That's the work to me. That's the healing. When people realize their own power, when they embrace and create their own narrative. That's what we have to be careful not to let someone else write our story for us or create our narrative. We do that. And we do a disservice if we think we can send them to school and they're going to tell them. We have to do that. That's my responsibility as an elder, as an educator, as a mother, as a grandmother, as a wife, is to instill in them what I know the shoulders they're standing on had. I have to do it for those upon whose shoulders I stand. And now I have to be the shoulders. Does that make sense? Yes. And so again, these are things that I think are they're not easy. And we got to lean in. You're in your own lane. Everybody on here is in a lane. Get in your lane, stay in your lane, do your work. That's why we have to do it. And we have to connect hearts, because that is what changes. At the end of the day, no matter what we do, if we can't change hearts, we're done. This is a wrap. But that requires proximity. It requires friendship. It requires us to be brave. And it's my hope that we can do that together. Unfortunately, I have to leave, but I'm happy to come back. If there's a time for me to come back, I'd be happy to come back.
Dr. DeGruy, we've had so many questions come in, and we're going to get through, and you've answered some of them, but we will definitely have you back. You've done a great education for us tonight. And I think that the questions are coming in. We thank you, and thank you for your time as well. Brother Mahershala, as you were asking these questions, I thought that some of the incoming we're getting so many questions. It's this incredible energy on this.
Please take over, brother. You got
it. So I feel like I got to get to some of these because we'll get overwhelmed. So let me try a few, but I think I'll direct this.
And I apologize because I'm not seeing the question, so I'm just in it here. So.
No problem. So I'll direct this to the Congresswoman and Dr. Rodney. There's a series of questions around voting, and particularly the idea. It's understood, of course. One questioner asks, Sister Aisha, the thief asks a very good question. It's commonly understood that voting is a franchise that an American citizen is entitled and encouraged to take advantage of. But when there are so many extremes in place today that deny the use of that franchise to Black Americans, to what degree can Black Americans feel that the efficacy of that franchise and that process? And we know that democratic movement is so essential. So can you address perhaps, Congresswoman, with some specificity, because you've seen this, of course, and we know about some of these systemic issues, about some of the work you may be doing in that space?
Oh, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were directing that to me.
Yes, Congresswoman, I wanted to ask about voting and barriers to
Oh, yeah.
voting
Okay.
in the Black
So,
community.
so you know, I mean, boy, you just talk about the height of hypocrisy. I mean, I focus on foreign affairs, and my focus on foreign affairs is Africa. And I'm supposed to run around to African countries and tell them about voting and democracy. And here we are in 2020, still fighting for the right to vote. And like my colleague said this morning, they're not doing things like how many jelly beans are in the jar, are charging you money to vote like they used to do in the past, a poll tax. Now what they're doing is telling you to risk your life, because the pandemic that was mishandled from the very beginning and is completely out of control in our country when it comes to elections. And we just had an election on Tuesday. You saw the folks in Kentucky couldn't find, well, I mean, the voting was closed. You saw them banging on the windows. I mean, that's something they'd say about an African country, right? Well, now the ballots need to be mailed so that people can vote at home safely. And it's a strategy that the Republicans always used, absentee voting. Well, now that we need to use it, now that we've gotten hip to it, now all of a sudden it's evil. But what I believe, because this is what I have seen, is that we can overcome voter suppression by organizing. We have done it successfully over and over again. And I actually think that that's why they've decided on a judicial strategy. I mean, they've been obsessed about approving judges because they realize that America is browning. And they are not going to be the majority forever, but the way that you can maintain power is through the courts, because you can begin to elect all the colored folks you want, but if you can take everything to court, then that's a problem. But again, I know that we can win, and we have, ever since this guy has been in office. I mean, it took the Republicans years to gain 1,000 legislative seats. We gained close to 400 in one cycle. So ever since he's been in, even though he's driven us crazy, the good side about his presidency is that he's been so extreme, he's forced us together. I mean, my joke is that he said he was going to bring us all together. Well, he has. He's brought us all together in opposition to him. But now we have this new awareness. We understand the relationship between our issues. And before, we kind of worked in silos. But he's pushed it so far to the brink that he has really forced folks to see what's at stake. I believe that this is our election to lose. The only reason that we would lose this election, I believe, would be because of successful voter suppression. And the only way voter suppression can be successful is if we don't organize. But what keeps me going is that there's thousands of people around this country, hundreds of thousands, that are activists, that are working in all these different levels. You don't necessarily see them all the time. Just because people aren't marching down the street doesn't mean that they're not active. They are, because now we have all this technology to be active, but we have demonstrated our power through all of these elections that we've been winning ever since this guy took office. Now we have to get rid of him. And then the problem we have in our country is we have two parties. I mean, we make believe like we have a bunch of parties, but we don't. We have two parties. The problem is one of those parties has been taken over by an extremist element. And they have to decide, do they want their party? Are they going to take it back? Or are they going to create a new party? Because that one party has decided to embrace, or if not embrace, they've decided not to fight the white supremacist element in their party.
Absolutely.
Dr. Rodney?
Well said. No, I was just co-signing, as you'd say, what our congresswoman was saying, and to point out that, you know, when in our situation in the United States, we have to be clear that we get to vote in elections typically every year. And we have elections that are federal level elections, state level elections, local elections. All of those elections have something to do with what happens in our lives every day. And so we can't discount that process. And what we know is that overwhelming numbers at the polls produce the kinds of results that we need to keep our kinds of people who are interested in social justice, especially today, interested in the cause of the people in office. So I think even though we have massive voter suppression, we know that we saw that in Florida, 1.5 million people received the franchise to vote again after the people of Florida voted for that. And the governor stood in the way of that and took it to court. But we have to continue to fight for that franchise. And all of us, especially people listening on this call, if you're in the United States, your election, this is our election cycle. Make sure you're registered to vote. Our young people who are turning 18, register to vote. The election is coming up. Make sure you vote, and try to get your absentee ballot and get it in.
As I was reflecting on both of these answers, Congresswoman Bass and Dr. Rodney's answers, I'm seeing a lot of this coming through a number of questions that we have. One of the things, Congresswoman Bass, before you joined, I talked a little bit about why we chose this phrase, supreme justice. This is a phrase that our international spiritual leader, His Holiness, recently used as a very important sort of Islamic ideal and Islamic concept, that there's just justice that's supreme, not race. In thinking about all of the work you're doing, and the ball is moving, sometimes the goalposts move, but the ball is moving forward. What do you think it will take to get supreme justice for Black Americans?
Well, and I'm going to have to leave you on this note, but first of all, we have to take over the US government. We have to have the White House, we have to have the Senate, we have to have the House. Until they decide what to do with their party, they really should not be in power right now. That's the bottom line. But really and truly, I believe that fundamental change happens with an inside and an outside strategy. So most of my life, I spent on the outside, organizing as an activist in the community, focusing on issues. And at a certain point in my life, I made the conscious decision to come to the inside, which is what I'm doing now in elected office. The inside doesn't work on our issues. Now, if you're running a corporation, you don't need the inside outside, but I'm talking about change that impacts our people. The only way it really happens in a fundamental way is if you have the pressure from the outside. Now, we wouldn't have even thought of doing a policing bill if there weren't hundreds of thousands of people out in 50 states, if we didn't have people around the world marching, if the 54 countries in Africa had gone to the UN and insisted that they deal with racism in the United States. It took all of that to get us to do a bill in 30 days. Congress can take 30 years or 30 days. We took 30 days because the masses demanded it. So I have viewed my mission in life is to build that movement. I'm working on the inside now, but I also work very closely with outside activists as well. And then I'm also extremely committed and really want to devote the next phase of my life to focusing on the next generation and making sure that those leaders that are coming up now have solid grounding with solid values and don't get caught up in American culture that makes them like, individuals that are very popular, where they get caught up in their egos. You have to be clear about what you're doing, because when you come in the inside, if you're not clear about who you are, if you're not clear about what you're trying to do, you will get lost. It's a big world that'll just spin you around. So I'm inspired, I really am. I know that things can feel overwhelming, like it is, we're suffering a pandemic right now, but it's an opportunity to fight for the life of our people, literally, but also fight for the underlying health conditions and get people to understand what those issues are. We've moved in this country. It's our job to keep that movement going. I appreciate being a part of this. This is a very deep discussion, not like many that I have. So I don't know if you do this regularly, but I'd love to come back and talk with you some more.
We would love to have you. This is our first part in this series. We're very grateful to have Mahershala facilitate this as well. But we, as you know, the Ahmadiyya Muslim Caucus in Congress is also focused on human rights issues and racial justice. And we would love to have you back. You're so generous with your time, with so much on your plate. And you've given us so much food for thought. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Congresswoman.
Likewise.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. Well, Mahershala, I'm getting questions, but I want you to also, with Dr. Rodney, come in here because, we have a lot to talk about and we have little time, and I'm cognizant we're almost hitting the hour-and-a-half mark, but we have a number of questions. And I guess, Professor Rodney, I think that the theme of a lot of these questions stem around the system, the barriers. And one of the major ones is the question that Hamad Chaudhry asks and some others as well, but why are more African-American males under the control of the criminal justice system now more than they were enslaved in 1850? This is what a point that Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow, she makes this point. So criminal justice reform and the systemized oppression, right? And we haven't talked about criminal justice, although there's legislative work in that space, but you can comment on that. And Mahershala, you as well, from what you've observed.
I like the doctor talk.
No, never. But I think what I'd say is, we heard some of that today from Dr. Joy. We've seen a situation where successive generations of African Americans have been literally displaced and pushed around in the society, and that leads to a great deal of instability. So I don't even want to, we can't misstate it, and we have to see it for what it really is. When you look at what some of the places we're talking about now, when you look at some of our major cities in the United States, with this, this divide down the middle of the city where half the population or a third of the population, primarily African American, is living in a space without services, without all of the kinds of things we would describe as being in a good neighborhood. That's structural. And what you find is every generation you have, gentrification, and then people move in search of a better life experience, and they go through that cycle again. And that breaks families, it breaks communities, and then you literally have the rest of the system standing by, whether it's the racism of the police or the family system, family services system to take kids out and put them in foster care and adoptive care and these kinds of things. So you really break the community at its core. And that then produces the result that we're institutionalized in many cases from birth to death, right? That's what Michelle Alexander was talking about in school to prison pipeline. When you look at suspension policies in schools, when you look at the kinds of ways in which Black bodies are criminalized even in school and then slowly criminalized into the society. These things are structural. And so we have to be able to uncover them as structural. They're not just a part of the fact that, Black people are dysfunctional. It's the way in which the society is set up. If I could reach out across this audience right now and ask most of the African Americans and Black men, especially across the country, have you ever experienced a highly charged police stop? Most of the audience will say yes, right? Where you are presumed guilty even before they stop the car, and all they then need is some charge to put on you, and that's it. You're off to prison.
Well, and also I think you have to think about the way in which when someone becomes aware, like culturally, when groups, and in this particular moment, we're speaking specifically about white America and those who've been in power. Once there's an awareness that publicly behavior X is deemed unethical, if you're still in power, there's still a desire to act in that way. So there's still a desire to be a supremacist, right? And so it may not play out in the way that people are on a plantation or they're sharecropping, but then it's clearly about labeling, the propaganda, the stereotyping, the lack of understanding of a culture of people that eventually just totally just paints a whole group of people as criminal. Therefore, leading to you having the permission to target that community for how you dress, how you may talk, how you walk around in a store. And once they have permission to target you, once that behavior is shifted from a very obvious form of racism, it becomes less obvious with the same intentionality and the same result. And the same result is the prison industrial complex. So once a community of people have been deemed a threat as a blanket statement, and there's cultural cues, a hoodie, Trayvon Martin, your pants are sagging, or your music's too loud. Like once there's these things that people associate with Blackness, and with directly synonymous with Blackness is crime and fear, and like I'm obviously speaking about people's perceptions, that it becomes very easy to find yourself as a young Black man or woman walking down the street like myself, months before I'm starring in a TV show, House of Cards, and a police officers in Berkeley, California, one of the most liberal cities in our country, roll up on me, follow me down the street walking, and go, you fit the description of a pimp, and need my ID, and start looking up and down, and like I'm on the street and I'm just there, and I'm so angry. And my anger felt justified, it felt righteous, so therefore it made me more angry because I knew I wasn't doing anything wrong. I didn't have nothing on me. I wasn't. So my point is, you end up creating a culture where one specific or a couple of pockets of people are deemed targets that serve a purpose, and then you end up serving in the slave system. You know, it doesn't mean that there aren't people who are Black or brown who have committed real crimes and should be there, you know, or have to, you know, you did the crime, you did the time and all that. It doesn't mean that everybody that is in jail should be on the streets. But my point is that we have woken up into a world where you are a target. And not only are you a target, your opportunities for education, your opportunities for upward mobility are very limited. And on top of that, every time you turn around, our families who have had to start over and over again because of not being being able to build generational wealth. So we find ourselves starting over and over and over again in these communities and trying to build something up to pass down to your children. And then you get pushed out of that neighborhood and you're starting up somewhere else all over again. And so there are so many factors in our world, in our country, that have contributed to the re-enslavement of Black and brown.
So many Black and brown people. Yeah.
Wow. We want to take it 15 more minutes. I know we're over time, but I want to take it 15 more minutes. I want to get a few questions from the audience. I see a few hands raised. They may have been earlier in the program. You're welcome to raise your hand. We'll take a few. I think there's a hand raised from Sister Umma Khan. Umma, we'll try to unmute your line here.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I think a great session. I don't have a question. I have more of suggestions for the next session, if I can speak.
Sure. We will get some few questions, but please go ahead.
So I think for the next session, we should definitely have a whole dedicated discussion upon the criminal justice system. And what the term specifically means. I know I posted this as well. A lot of people have the false persona that we need a reformation in the system. It's broken. When you know, when in like reality, it was never built for reformation. It was built to enslave Black people, as we've discussed. And also in a lot of our communities, there's, you know, that persona about like, you know, the criminal justice system and about, you know, how we see the Black community or those who are enslaved in the system as like criminals. It exists within, you know, the Pakistani community, and it's very important to discuss the war on drugs, like post-capitalism, and how there's such inequality of, you know, crime, a white man versus a Black man, drugs, you know, how, you know, marijuana is seen as, you know, the biggest drug. So I feel like there's so much within that discussion itself that we could dedicate a whole session upon. So I just wanted to suggest that.
I'll say, Uma, that you've raised, we're going to have multiple parts coming up in God willing on a number of these fronts. You've raised some really good points. I will mention one point here, and I want to hear from Mahershala and Dr. Rodney on this. You know, this idea of trying to deal with this notion of an innocent life. You know, the idea that if you have committed a low-level crime, or if you have done a crime because of very, very extenuating circumstances, that can put you in a position of incarceration, and that you could be subject to police brutality. That life, even though there may be a criminal conviction, is still innocent. Now, this is something that the international spiritual head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community has commented on, that those who have committed low-level crimes, or those who have committed crimes because of circumstances where they have to put food on their table, they are still innocent. And the stigma that's attached to criminality is dangerous. And so and of course you mentioned, Uma, about the war on drugs. So the idea of criminal justice and the idea of how to ensure that so many who are suffering right now because of that criminal baggage, which has been perpetrated in many cases from institutional oppression, how to deal with that, how to, you know, reach out to that community, and how do we create the real change through the democratic process? Can either of you comment on that?
Well, I think number one, I agree with our dear sister that fundamentally, I was going to say that in relation to Mahershala Sahib's question about, you know, you have a body that has this debilitating cancer everywhere. How do you cure it? And I think one of two things fundamentally has to happen. Either the body must die, which shocks all of us, I guess, or it gets completely renewed, right? And that complete renewal is going to create a completely different body, if you will, than the one that existed before. You know, it's like these extreme makeover kind of things, right? So if we think about it in that way, we are in fact anticipating the reinvention of society. And if you look at the history of our people here in the United States, right, our formerly enslaved people, our African people who have been victimized here in America, the work that they've done has in fact created a different society that we can live in today than the one they lived in. That America, in a way, is a different America from this one, even though some of the problems of that America persists. It's a kind of different America. And I think that's what will have to happen when we talk about criminal justice reform and police reform and these kinds of things. We'll create radically new arrangements that we don't even really know about now. And that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. But like you're saying, Amjad, that will happen as we anticipate through what the Congresswoman calls the inside-outside work, right? There are those, all of us don't have to be out in the street running around screaming and yelling and raising our voice, right? We can do that from using the tools we have. And I won't say inside the system in that way, because if it is the case that we know this, that the way in which, especially American society structure, they don't want us to exercise the right to vote, right? The power elite and powerful in the society don't want us to exercise that right. So in a way, they want to keep us away from the ballot box as much as possible. They want to keep us away from running for office as much as possible. They want to keep us outside of anything that's going to diffuse and change power interactions, power relationships in the society. So technically, we're outside, still trying to force our way in, right? And so that, I think, is going to be where this work will continue, right? And as I want to address the subtlety of this innocent lives issue as well, right? We've looked at just the cases, the preponderance of cases where DNA evidence has exonerated so many people in the United States, and especially African-American people, right? Men especially who have been incarcerated, sometimes for 30 or 40 years, right? On a trumped-up case, no evidence, just somebody just invented a lie, stuck it on a person and took their lives away, right? And we're seeing some movies come out now about that, and we're seeing the Innocence Project and other justice projects that focus on that. So in that case, our lives are structurally bound to a circumstance that predetermine our outcomes, right? And I think that's what we're seeing here in this society, where our outcomes are predetermined. Either you're going to be a slave, right, through some means, or you're not going to be a part of the society. And so here we have a circumstance where we're pushing back against that and saying, well, that person who has been falsely accused and incarcerated is an innocent person. That person who finds themselves on a corner and can't get a job for 20, 30 years because they live in the wrong zip code. I mean, that is a structural problem, and that's an innocent person, right? That person who won't get the scholarship just because we didn't like the fact that they didn't look the way we thought they looked, or they didn't speak the way we thought they spoke to Black, or looked to Black. Those kinds of things. That's a violation of just a human person. So I think those issues will be in front of us. We have to fight to change them, and that's where the revolution, the shifting the society, has to come about.
I would just add that you need the opportunity to do right before your actions can just be deemed wrong. So if you remove the opportunity for someone to make a just or righteous action, you take away all the resources and opportunities for someone to be able to now, and also think about someone who is somehow as a teenager, or you turn 18, 19, you do a petty crime or whatever. And once you're in the system, you get out and you try to get gainful employment. And that crime hangs over your head. And so therefore, that is an experience that you will continue to have perhaps for the rest of your life, because you're not given the opportunity to make choices that can be productive and healthy for your life. So if you're born into circumstances, or you're born poor or low income, and you go into to public schools that essentially are crowd control, they're overcrowded, kids are not learning. You have food deserts in Black and brown communities where kids don't have access to affordable, good food. How does that impact one's behavior and attention span in classrooms that are overpopulated? If you're constantly renting, and everyone can only rent, and the insurances cost a premium to live in these neighborhoods. So you end up taking Black and brown people who are on the fringes, who are basically forced to make the best of what you have access to. You remove that, you remove opportunity from the society, and then you judge them on your laws that inherently represent the opportunity that you're born with. So you create an impossible standard for somebody to even be deemed a good citizen, because you got all the opportunity, you are the first priority. It's like someone take the fruit and eat all the good parts of it and leave you the rind and the seeds and go make a meal out of that. And so for somebody to be really held accountable, and that's why what I appreciate about my faith is that we look at God as being the best of judges, and we'll judge accordingly in terms of like, once we have to meet our maker and look at the body of our actions and the good deeds out needing to outweigh the bad and so on and so forth, that the reason why I believe we say, or, you know, the Quran and like Islamic teaching, it emphasizes that God is the best of judges, is because God has to take into account what it is, your circumstances, what it is that specifically makes life difficult and challenging for you, and also looks at the person who has resources and access and opportunity, and looks at what it is that they did with that blessing, with that gift of those resources and opportunity and access. And did they share that? Did they lift someone else up? Did they raise them up? And if they kept a knee on their neck, they will be held, we believe that they will be held accountable for that. In this life, perhaps, but certainly in the afterlife, you know? Yeah. So I think that you have to consider the fact that we are not running a race we're not on a level playing field. And so, and that's not to look at Black people with any pity, because that's not what Black people want. We want, I can't speak for everybody, but I believe that the vast majority of our community would like, we would like for people to be aware and recognize the differences between the cultures, the privileges that they have inherently had and benefited from in this race, this human race, yes, in this country for 400 years, that if we're all running a race and trying to build our communities in a positive way and say, let's pretend like we're all allies in this from the start, we can't have two people running and one person's got 10-pound ankle weights on and this other person doesn't, and expect us to finish the same or be able to compete or be able to hold our own. And then they will look at us and go, oh, you need help? Oh, those poor people, they need some help. Let's give them a little bit of money and support them while they're just sprinting along. I'm like, just take the ankle weights off. That's the only help we need. Just take off the ankle weights, you know? So I sorry to get long-winded, but I really feel like it's important to understand this culture and the context that we exist in and what we have to navigate as a people to be able just to be citizens that you take for granted next door in the most positive way. Like, yeah, that's my neighbor so-and-so who happens to be Black. Like, it's very difficult for us to get to that point where we are a neighbor in a middle-class neighborhood. There's middle-class Black folks and wealthy Black folks across the country, for sure. But for us to get to that place, we are always climbing a mountain to get to these places that many white people are able to just sort of
step in,
experience. You know, there's poor white people around all over the country, but often white people's poor is their bottom is different from our bottom. If that's your bottom, our bottom is much further than that. So it's almost like that bottom serves as a low middle for us. And that is just the reality, because we're not supported in a way where, and I don't mean it like we need a handout, but again, you have example after example of our communities being built on our own, having successful communities, and because of jealousy, burning down, literally bombing. The first community bombed was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the United States. They hadn't even bombed another country yet, but they bombed Tulsa, Oklahoma.
With planes.
Yeah, you know, and so you have the Tulsa situation, but then you also have the Homestead Act, where you have white families being supported into home ownership and being able to have generational wealth, and Black people told that, nah, you can't have a home. I don't care if your experiences or your credit or your finances are comparable to this. Like, it's not legal for you to live in this neighborhood. You have to live in this more populated apartment type area in downtown where we will not even insure you to own a house. You can live there, right? So it so much contributes to us just being in this moment and sort of circling this toxic drain.
Mm-hmm. Wow, we're hitting the hour and 45-minute mark. I do think we have a number of hands up, number of questions that we won't be able to get through all of them. I'm going to take a question live, and then I'll also take a question on the chat box before we have to bring this to a close because it's a longer program. If that's okay with Mahershala and Basiyr, because I know it's been a long. Okay, great. Kamaldeen Wheely, you had a hand up. You still have a question. We can unmute you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah for the opportunity to ask this question. So we are talking about injustice, and the way I see it is like perfectly described by Brother Ali, is a cancer in America that has metastasized into different systems, actually all the systems in America. So my question is this: how possible will it be to have a constitutional review conference in which we'll have adequate representation of what we know as America, where we can have inclusive discussion about so many things that has been affected by this cancer?
Dr. Rodney.
So I would say this, right? The if and when changes to the Constitution are needed, I think the United States has done that a couple of times, and there's a number of amendments. You know, the Bill of Rights is meant to protect the rights of American people, and primarily they were created for white American people. We understand that. Even now, we learn from the 13th Amendment and how it was meant to free Black people and end slavery, but it turned out to create a different kind of enslavement. I think that day will come again, but I think the path to it, and I say that just because because you asked a question, but I think the path to it is as we're seeing now. The activism at the local level, changing laws at the local level, and you see people struggling to do that now. The police reform bill that we just talked about with the Congressman Bass and other police reform bills at the state level and at the city level. Minneapolis just voted to end policing as we know it. For them, they don't even know what new policing is going to look like, right? But they have already voted that that's going to be different for them. Because one of the ways in which you get to constitutional change in the United States is through these series of local shifts. And I think what we're seeing right now is going to be a kind of seismic local shift. And the election is going to tell us more as well. But that's what you're seeing. You're seeing police bills that are designed to question voting rights, policing, criminal justice reform, education at local levels, at state levels, and they're driving to the federal level as well. So I think it's just a matter of time before it becomes a question of constitutional change. But we can't discount the fact that, in the kind of system we have in the United States, local matters, state matters. A lot of our funding for things like public education is at the municipal level, right? Federal government doesn't write our check for our public education system. That's written in your local town. Yeah. So how many of us are actively engaged with the local school board where they make decisions about how money is going to be allocated for our kids, right? How many people have gone to a school board meeting where a lot of these kinds of things happen, right? So I think, yeah, the big picture of Constitution matters, but we're a federal system, and other parts of the federal system, other parts of the system require deep attention as well.
Yeah, there's a question here from Irene Amina, who asks about, who observes that police reform has been attempted time and time again. Some scholars, especially abolitionists, have written about how abolition or major defunding is the only solution that does not center policing as an effective way to change communities. And she asks a very thought-provoking question: do you think reform does more harm than good? And we obviously don't have the Congresswoman here, but Mahershala, maybe you can talk a little bit about this idea of reform, and you were getting at it, I think, with some of the questioning earlier.
Well, I honestly think that I do not think reform does more harm than good. What I think is fake reform does more harm than good. Like if you have a flood in your house, you have a pipe busted, you don't get to just like paint or throw some new tile down on the floor. Like you got to address the issue. And so often we are caught in this negotiation in our country between what is right and what will allow someone to politically survive. And so a bill gets proposed knowing that there's going to be this ongoing negotiation to inch towards what is right, even when one side of it knows that they're blanketly wrong. And that's why for centuries you could say, in response to, the civil rights movement or just civil liberties and whatnot, the response has always been, be patient, be patient, be patient, right? And so much of that just goes back to the fact that people are not willing to see what this country needs to do to really implement real change. And so this negotiation on people presenting these ideas, these truths, sharing numbers and statistics and saying like this particular issue is problematic, there's always somebody on the other side trying to hold on to what they have in their view of the world and refusing to embrace the reality that is going to allow for real change to happen. So, but yes, if you look at so many systems, the attempts to reform, I would question the sincerity behind the reform. But I would also say the very things that we use to argue for equality, a lot of it goes back to what was initially written in the laws of our land. So we are intelligent enough to say, hey, that Equal Rights Amendment should include so-and-so, or this amendment early on should include all of these people, right? And so that we can use so much of what is already there in order to make sure that regardless of if they intended to include Black people or not, the fact that it is written, their interpretation of who a human is today should not be that I am 3/5 of a human being. It should be that I am a whole human being. Like a lot of people don't know, they deemed us by law to be less than human, which allowed them to justify how we were being treated in so many other aspects of this life. So I think many of the laws and things that have been implemented and used in our time have to be looked at and reinterpreted through contemporary eyes and make sure that everybody is included when it says we the people,
Well said. We have a number of questions that we appreciate all the hands up. We're going to have to bring this to a close. And I just wanted to note that all of the questions we had, I think 45 open questions right now, we've answered, maybe half of them. There are a number of themes that have emerged from these questions that I've noted and that we're going to have future parts on, but we haven't touched on the so-called Black on Black violence. A few questions came on what to make of that. What's the basis for that? Is that used as a crutch? What kind of, what is that in any way a barrier to reform? There's a question about representation, Black representation in law enforcement, the judiciary, government. Is it tokenism in policy? Is it real representation? And this came up in a bit earlier in a few places, but the idea of real reform and instead of just mere symbolism, and to what extent do we carry those reforms? There's a question about allies of the Black. How do you become an ally of the Black American community? What makes an ally? And we talked a little bit about this with Dr. DeGruy. So some of these themes we'll discuss in much more detail as we make our way and funnel our way from this broad conversation about what now to some of these deep dives, and maybe even get Congresswoman Bass and Dr. DeGruy back to talk about some of these issues as well. There may be other questions and other topics. Mahershala, Those are just some things that came to my mind. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing, Amjad. What's important to keep in mind is the fact that you can begin to point out other issues that could be topics for a 2-hour conversation. This is my point earlier on, and that this is not something to be fixed during COVID or for a couple of weeks. This is work. It's taken centuries to get to this moment. So we're going to have a world of questions that end up feeding into shining a light on all the systems that make up, that contribute to what we know as life here in America, you know, and even globally in many cases, you know, when it comes down to race relations and experiences. So there are a world of topics to tackle and questions and things to wrap your head around and things to revisit. Just because you had a conversation about Black psychic trauma or what have you, all right, on to the next. Like, no, like these things, these ideas are things that you have to wrestle with, and that I'm sure my good brother could speak to, that these are things that we grapple with. Even if you're not conscious of it, you grapple with it every single day when you walk in your neighborhood. That may be, if you're in a middle-class neighborhood, it may be mostly white. You're walking with your kids. Like, there's things that you recognize and experience. You know, there's things that you recognize and experience when you go grocery shopping, when you get pulled over by police, whether the police officer is a great guy or not, you still have a reaction to being trained, knowing that you have had several experiences, either yourself or with family or whatnot, where that reaction with that police officer has not been positive. You know, the disparities in illnesses and what's happening with COVID and all. There's so many things that we could talk about where you cannot do the Black experience, the Black and brown experience, any kind of justice with one talk, 5 times. This is a lifelong conversation that if you could be a fly on the wall of any Black barbecue, any Black holiday, any experience that has a collective of Black people together, you will understand that this is casual conversation for us.
Yeah.
This is normal, these issues. Like, it really is. And so the questions will always come. I'm just glad that people have taken a moment and care enough to listen and engage and recognize a few things, because I don't expect this world, personally, I don't expect anything to change overnight, but I'm appreciative of this opening that has happened, this X-ray, so that we could do a diagnostic and see where this virus is living, and discovering where it is living in our human body, in our system, so that those who are willing to do the work and who have been doing the work before this new awakening can continue to do it. And those who are just now becoming aware can jump on board and figure out how they can begin to look at themselves, look at their own life, you have a business. How many people work at the business? You got 20 people, you're a business owner. How many Black and brown people work at that business? Or how many people from who have the potential to serve in that company? How many people that are Black and brown have you given an opportunity to? Have you even interviewed? Have you looked at? Have you considered? And why haven't you? There's so many things that we as individuals, and not necessarily policymakers, can do to begin to nurture our awareness, because we know nothing changes without awareness. Nothing sustainably changes without consciousness. So therefore, once you're aware, you can kind of move through the world with intention, with awareness, with clarity. You can even begin to check yourself about ideas that you have that are that could be oppressive in nature, or serve to suppress someone else, whatever, you know? So I just think that I just want to make the point that we can't necessarily for 1 second take this moment and find ourselves disappointed and not being able to get to so many different things, because that is sort of my point in that this is life work. This is work that has to happen until equality, until there is supreme justice.
Well, supreme justice, and this is very important for everyone to understand, supreme justice is not just a hashtag. It's not just the name of this program. It's not just the name of a virtual series. It's a movement, a movement. And, you know, when His Holiness, the spiritual leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, talks about supreme justice, he says exact pressure, so that those who are in positions of authority are forced to act with justice. He talks about mobilizing to use civic and democratic rights, bring a change at all levels. You know, he talks about astute ways to pressure authorities. So Dr. Rodney, talk to us a bit about this kinetic energy, right? This is the movement that we need. What can we do? What, beyond just these programs, in the short term, in what we're thinking about tomorrow, what can we do?
So I would say make it a part of our daily education. We're living in a time now where a lot of this information is floating around on YouTube and, of course, in books and so forth. But we must make it a part of our daily exercise to try to educate ourselves about the kinds of inequities and injustice that we see in the society. So, for example, just this morning, I was looking at an article that just talked about the way in which the Harvard University were built by people who were highly racist in their orientation, right? Lots of those big donors and contributors and professors and scholars, and how they justified scientific racism and these other things. So I think education is key. The other thing I would always add as well is look at the circle in which we associate. And this is for everybody. We have to become uncomfortable with being in a place where we are the only people. Because the truth is, as Black people, we don't have that luxury, right? It is rare that we can move through the society and move through and not see and experience and be and try to understand other people. We have to. We wouldn't survive in a highly racialized society like this one if we didn't have to make ourselves uncomfortable to go to the store or to go to the bank or to go to the business office downtown. That's our world, right? But too many of our citizens, whether it's white or other groups of people, are just completely comfortable with moving through a society where they never get to see us, right? Never experience us. And then they carry all these stereotypes and negative energy about us. So my thing is, make yourself uncomfortable. Come out of your comfort zone. Really own the relationships that we claim we have with people, with Black people and other people of color. And then finally, what I would say is recognize that our actions have value. We're coming up on an election. We're coming up on not just picking a national leader, but we're picking local leaders. Who are the people you're picking or selecting? You're selecting judges. In the United States, we vote for judges, you know, the people who are going to give us, you know, the 3 strikes and you're out kind of laws, right? We put these people in office. Do we know who they are? Do we check the ballot and say, you know, who is this guy? And what was his voting record? And what kind of people did he put in prison, kind of thing, right? So we have to learn to educate ourselves and then take active steps to become, to initiate justice. You know, Allah tells us in the Quran, when Allah wants to bring about a thing, he intentionalizes it. He says to it, be, and it becomes. So we have to intentionalize as well, right? The Prophet Muhammad taught us, he said, your actions begin with intention. So you have to intend to be an anti-racist, right? It's not enough to just say, well, I'm not racist and I'm cool, but you intend to be an anti-racist. And that's an everyday work. That's an everyday work. You get up tomorrow morning and you say to yourself, what did I do today to be an anti-racist? Because this is a problem throughout my society and I want to see it go away.
That's a very powerful close, Dr. Rodney. Thank you so much. Mahershala, always a pleasure. I think we've gone a long time here. We've covered a lot of ground. I know there will be a short survey that our team is going to pop up here couple questions that it'll help us in feedback and planning. I hope each of you can fill that out. It's on your screen now. I wanted to thank Dr. Joy DeGruy and Congresswoman Karen Bass for amazing contributions. Like I said, we need them back to discuss these issues in more detail. We will announce the second part of our series soon. It will be coming soon. Look for those announcements from the organizers here, from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Again, I want to thank each of you for spending so much of your precious time this evening to listen to us, and we hope that this sparks conversations that have real change. So please take the survey. I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Good to see you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.